Now we're going to the book of Jonah, a story that you've known for a long, long time, but a book that has enormous power. And this has already been given away, but the fish has always been a question mark, and I finally figured out what the fish was. It's this one. Who's that? What's that name of that fish? Nemo. And what kind of fish was Nemo?
Clownfish.
The clownfish. Jonah is the clownfish of the Bible, if you will. You're supposed to smile and laugh when you read the book of Jonah, and there's a lot of reasons for that. Perceptions of the book of Jonah is that it's a story for children. You've known this a long time ago. You're an adult. It's probably a legend or a myth, and we're adults. Why would you bother us with the book of Jonah? But at the end of our lecture, you're going to come out of here just like this woman and say, "Oh, I never knew that such a thing was true about this wonderful book." Jonah's name is an exception to the names of writing prophets. The names of all the writing prophets are names honoring God. Name a prophet. Give me a prophet's name. Writing prophet. Jeremiah means Yahweh is lifted up. Give me another one.
Isaiah.
Isaiah, salvation is of Yahweh. Someone else, give me another one. You've read the prophets.
Amos.
Joel, Yahweh is God. Give me another one.
Amos.
Amos, burden. The prophetic office is a burden because you're bringing an announcement of judgment, and it's a burden to God as well as to the messenger of God. Another? Ezekiel, seized by God. And you think of the visions of that apocalyptic book, and he's carried by God in visions to Jerusalem from Babylon. One more.
Micah.
Micah, who is like God. The names of the writing prophets are all names honoring God, except for this guy. His name is Dove. Dove in our language, in our culture, is a symbol of peace. But in Bible times, in biblical literature, dove was a silly, easily frightened little bird that flits away at the first sign of trouble. And Jonah's name is a joke name. And the book of Hosea speaks of a dove as being an easily frightened bird. So he sets himself apart from other prophets. He's the only prophet of Israel or Judah actually sent by God to travel to another country outside the commonwealth of Israel. Isaiah has long oracles against the nation, so does Jeremiah, and so does Ezekiel. But none of them actually traveled to another country to bring a message of God to another people group. Ezekiel and Daniel were in Babylon, but they weren't set there with a message from God. They were taken off as captives. Amos came from Tekoa in Judah, but he went up to Israel, which is a part of the Hebrew Commonwealth. Jonah's unique in this. His is the only prophetic book. You know, we have 16 of them, 12 shorter and 4 longer. His is the only prophetic book in which there's no oracle. There's no oracle of judgment, and there's no promise of mercy. There's just the statement that God sent him off to announce judgment, but we don't have the beautiful poetry that we expect in a prophet. And he's the only prophet who actually disobeys the commands of God and then writes about it. Jonah is a prophet who is unique from all the other writing prophets. Now, in Jonah's day, there was no Starbucks and there was no newspaper. I wouldn't want to have lived then. But Jonah knew his times, and he knew his enemies, and he knew his Bible, he knew Torah, and he knew God. And Jonah lived in very perilous times. Jonah knew Exodus 34, verses 5 to 7. This is the pinnacle of God's self-revelation. Exodus 34 is when Moses is hidden in the cleft of the rock, and God is going to show Moses more of his glory than Moses had ever experienced. And God comes down and he describes himself as compassionate beyond imagination, as patient beyond expectation, and filled with grace and truth. Jonah knew that, and he actually quotes it against God in anger. We're not going to go verse by verse or chapter by chapter. We're going to go all over the book. Turn to chapter 4, because I'm assuming you know the story. In chapter 4, when the judgment of God did not come, Jonah is mad at God. And he says, you know, the thing I really don't like about you is that you're too good. And the funny thing there, you're supposed to be laughing as you read this. If God weren't as good as he is, Jonah would have been fried for complaining. But in chapter 4, verse 2, he quotes Exodus 34, 5 and 6 in complaint. He says, here's the big problem I have with you, God. You are gracious and merciful, slow to anger, abundant in loyal love, one who relents from doing harm. He says, it just makes me sick that you're so kind. Because he wanted the Assyrians to fry, and they didn't. And it just, you're too good. And again, you're supposed to smile at that, because if God wouldn't good, bye-bye Jonah. We've never heard the story. Now, Jonah lived during the time of the increasing threat from the Assyrians. The date for the book of Jonah and the time of Amos and the time of Hosea is 760 BC. That's the peg date. And this was during the reign of Jeroboam II. And Jeroboam II was at the zenith of his reign, and he had surpassed boundaries for the northern kingdom from earlier kings. It was a time of wealth and prosperity, and yet it was 760. That's as good as Israel will ever get. And from that point on, it's a downward decline as the Assyrians are on their way west. Here is iconography of the Assyrians, and they're on their way. Here's Nineveh, an image of the mound of that magnificent city. And the Assyrians were known for war and torture in a way that surpassed all the other people groups of the ancient Near East. To say Assyrian army is to put fright in people. We have so many pictures that they left behind because they were proud of their barbarism. Here is a drawing on a bas-relief, the bringing of severed heads after a battle. So they would decapitate their fallen victims and bring the heads as proof of their victories. Here's another, piled heads in relief from the reign of Ashurbanipal, who is long before, in the 669 to 627 BC. So that's following this time of our book. Here are two Assyrian soldiers erecting a stake with an impaled naked man beside two others. These things are a part of their own artistic memory. In bas-relief, they celebrated their victories. When the Assyrians destroyed the city of Lachish under Sennacherib in 701, they had embedded reporters, and they had digital photographers. Well, they had the equivalents of those in their days. There were reporters writing notes of every stage of the battle, and artists drawing sketches. And when they got back to Nineveh, a massive bas-relief was constructed. It's about 40 feet long, 8 to 10 feet high, and it has every stage of the battle. This is one of them from the relief from Lachish. Unbelievable cruelty, dismemberment, and horrible treatment of their victims. The Assyrian advance, there's Nineveh in the modern country of Iraq, in the far north of Mesopotamia, and they're coming west, and then they're going to come south along the coast, the Mediterranean coast, the Levant. And on their target list are the lands of Israel and Judah. Tiglath-Pileser III came into power, and in 3 successive campaigns, 734, 733, 732, he made the northern kingdom a province of the Assyrian Empire. In 734, he came along the ocean, the Mediterranean Sea, taking out cities and populaces in far north Syria, in Phoenicia, in the regions that had been Philistia, and he conquered Egypt so that he controlled the whole seawall. 733, he conquers the cities of Israel. He brought Samaria under siege, didn't destroy it, but took enormous goods from the city, as well as people, and beautiful girls, beautiful boys, for his soldiers to sodomize and rape. A horrible devastation. And 733 is actually the end of the northern kingdom, because at that point, Israel, the northern kingdom, became a part of the empire of Assyria. 732, he conquers the eastern parts of the Bible world, taking out the great kingdom of Aram, which is ancient Syria, and taking control of all the holdings of Judah in Transjordan. The only thing left that he hadn't conquered was the city of Jerusalem and a part of Judah, which was a Judean island in the Assyrian Sea. Here is a picture of Tiglath-Pileser. This is his official photograph. I took a picture of this in the British Museum, but Kathy decided to put this one in my slides because it's a little sharper than mine. But look at the elaborately coiffed beard and hairstyle, the massively exaggerated musculature of his upper arm and shoulder. And do you see he's even wearing a Rolex watch? Or it looks like it, doesn't it? So this is the guy. This is Tiglath-Pileser III. And in the 730s, he was the most powerful warrior in the Near East. The hordes came again in 722, Shalmaneser V, Sargon II, and that's when Samaria was destroyed. But it had been set under siege by Tiglath-Pileser III 11 years earlier. They came again in 701, and that's Sennacherib, and he's the one who set siege to Lachish and had a massive victory, and then set siege to Jerusalem and found his army destroyed by the hand of God. So what did Jonah knew? Well, in the 760s, he knew that his king was at the apex of his reign, that the Assyrians were gathering strength, and that God, as always, is God of grace. These are the things Jonah knew 30 years before the end came for the northern kingdom. Now, his contemporaries were Amos and Hosea, as I mentioned earlier. Amos came from Judah, a small village in Judah called Tekoa, and he came up to Bethel to speak against the lack of justice in Israel. Martin Luther King, Jr. quoted Amos repeatedly, and with the idea of a hope that righteousness would one day flow like a river. But anyway, it's a contemporary of Jonah. Hosea lived in Samaria, and he was a contemporary of Jonah as well. And his focus was on idolatry. And God had him marry a prostitute, probably a cultic prostitute, so that his marriage would replicate the disastrous marital relationship of God and Israel in the figurative language of the Bible. And Jonah of Samaria was charged to report the enormity of God's judgments and the riches of his grace. So this triumvirate, this trifecta, 3 prophets, Amos, Hosea, and Jonah, all contemporary, 760 BC, a call for justice, a call against idolatry, and a recognition of God's wonderful mercy, but his devastating judgment. So God's work in judgment. This sounds wrong, but I assure you it's correct. Whenever God announces judgment, it's an opportunity for mercy, because if God announces judgment, it means it's the last thing he wants to do. Oh. Well, there's another one. All right, I'm just making this up. But if God's intent is judgment, he just do it. I don't say, little ant, your days are done. I just do it. And if God's intent is to bring judgment, he just do it. But when he announces it, there's the possibility of a response that will allow God to back off, to delay, or even to cancel the words of judgment. He doesn't take pleasure in judgment. Some people think this is what the Old Testament is about, is storms and insects and death and gloom. Actually, the Hebrew Bible is a record of God's patience as the reasons for judgment accumulate. Isaiah 28, verse 21 is an amazing verse. I teach this in my classes, and one of my students is now writing his doctoral dissertation on this verse. The judgment of God is a real thing. Isaiah says he will rise up again as at Mount Perazim and be angry as in the days of the valley of Gibeon. These are celebrated acts of judgment. But when he does so, his work of judgment is called zar, strange, and unusual, no kriya. That is, the normal work of God is mercy and kindness and forgiveness. But there comes a point when the word of God about himself in Exodus 34, verse 6, that I have a very long nose. Isn't that a funny expression? I have a very long nose, off benign. I have a very long nose. The idea is, Derek Apine, very long. The idea is it takes a long time for rage to reach the tip of God's nose. But eventually it will come, but when I do it, it is not my common work, it's not my central work, it's my strange or unusual work. And Jonah knew that. God has some fun with Jonah. Remember, you're supposed to smile as you read this book. After Jonah complained, God caused a plant to grow to give Jonah shade. After all, this is in Iraq. I have a nephew who served he was in 4 deployments in Iraq, and they were in the summer, and he told me, Uncle Ron, it is really, really hot, 120 degrees some days. And so Jonah's sitting in the heat and looking at this city that isn't smoking yet, and he's praying God will finally bring the judgment that he promised. And God gives Jonah a shade, and then God takes the plant away with a worm, and Jonah's crying about the plant. And God says to him, you've had pity on a plant? Shouldn't I pity Nineveh? And he says, what would it take for you to show some feeling? Do you know how many children were in that city? That there were 120,000 persons who don't know the difference between left and right hand. If I'd have brought the judgment, it wouldn't just be the soldiers that would die, but 120,000 miners. Does that mean anything to you? What about the animals? Does anything get to you? You're supposed to smile at that. But you're also supposed to understand Jonah's reasoned flight. When he fled from before the Lord, he concluded, apparently, that if he didn't announce judgment, then there'd be no opportunity for the people to respond, and then maybe God would take them out. And he wanted them to be taken out because Jonah knew his times, and he knew what the Assyrians were, and he knew that if God didn't take them out, the Assyrians would take out Israel. So that's what it's all about. So he was supposed to go to Nineveh, and instead he went down to Joppa, to Yaffo, to a Philistine port city, and he got on a Phoenician ship to go to the opposite end of the known world of his day, and he was going to go all the way to Tarshish, which is the Old Testament word for Spain. Now you're supposed to laugh at that too. Here's a true prophet of God, man who knows God, and he's going to run away from God? He's going to get on a ship and maybe God wouldn't notice? I mean, you're supposed to laugh at that. How silly. I thought this is a person who knows God, and he does, but he's so desperate, he thinks if I just get out of the center of things, then maybe God will bring destruction on Nineveh anyway. Now, when he gets on the ship, I have a big problem with this. Jonah, like other Hebrew people, were terrified of the ocean. They viewed the oceans like the Canaanites before them and among them as a malevolent beast. And the Canaanites deified the ocean and spoke of the ocean as a malevolent god. Jonah had never been on a rowboat, and he gets on a ship to go to Spain, Tarshish. How in the world did he do that? Number one, there was no Carnival Cruise Line in those days. All the ships were cargo ships, so he had to bribe a captain to take passage in a hold where, there were the goods being transported, perhaps wine, and he's going to go all the way to the opposite end of the Mediterranean. And when the storm came, he's sound asleep. And the sailors, who were, the Hebrew word used for them in chapter 1 is old salts, people who were experienced with the sea, they're puking out, yesterday's lunch, and they're terrified. They know they're going to drown, and Jonah's sleeping? How could that happen? So I have a private view that he took something. He took a drug. It's from a mushroom. I believe he was just drugged out of his mind, because how could he sleep on a ship that's about to sink in a storm that the sailors had never experienced the likes of before? So this is just such a strange story. Now, there are two responses to Jonah's ministry. The one is the Assyrians, and the other is the sailors in chapter 1. So turn to chapter 3. Again, I'm assuming you know the story well, but look at chapter 3. The name of God, Yahweh, is used in the first paragraph, and you know when Yahweh is there because not only is the L capitalized, but the letters O-R-D are in small caps. So are you looking at your Bible? Do you see verse 1, chapter 3? Now the word of Yahweh came to Jonah, ... So Jonah rose, went to Nineveh according to the word of Yahweh. Now, look at chapter 4. So Jonah prayed to Yahweh, and he said, Ah, Yahweh, verse 3. O Yahweh, verse 4. Then Yahweh said. So the name of Yahweh is used in chapter 3 at the beginning and throughout chapter 4. But in verses 5 through 10, where it talks about the response of the Assyrians, the name Yahweh is not used. Now, this is something that would escape many readers unless they're aware of the significance of the use of the name of God. So when it says in verse 5, the people of Nineveh believed in God, that doesn't mean that they came to saving faith. So many people have said this is the greatest miracle of revival, of evangelism, of a people coming to faith in the history of the world. But if that were the case, We wouldn't have 6:30 after, 7, let's see, get my dates right, 7:30 after 7:60. It wouldn't be 30 years later that there'd be no memory of this, and there's no record of it. It didn't happen. What happened was the people believed that the threat of destruction was real because they believed Moses knew what he was talking about, but they're polytheists. They believe in many gods. And they took that here was a holy man representing a true God, and it was a true threat. And so humility from the emperor on down to the meanest slave averted the judgment. But that's all that happened. Did some Assyrians come to faith? Maybe, but certainly not the nation. The wording is subtle, but highly significant. And the people respond to the threat of Jonah's God, whom they took to be a God, not the only God, not the God of the Bible. So it's short of saving faith. But the greater response is in chapter 1. And this is when we read about the Phoenician sailors. Jonah's often presented as a missionary book. That always puzzles me. A missionary goes to another populace, cross-cultural setting, and presents the story of the grace of God. Jonah was sent to announce judgment. Well, how do you make that a missionary story? But the people who came to faith were Phoenicians on the ship, the sailors. The sailors were scared to death at the wind and the storm. Verse 5, they were afraid, and they all screamed out to their own gods. This is showing us how polytheistic these men were as well. And then they awakened Jonah, and they found that he gave his testimony. He hadn't got on that ship to share the 4 laws. He hadn't come with gospel tracts. He was on there incognito. He didn't want anyone to know who he was. But he finally was forced to tell them who he was. Now look at verse 10. Now the men were exceedingly afraid. They'd been afraid, but now they're really afraid. They feared with a great fear. The words of Jonah 1:10 are really powerful. Vayira ha'anashim yira gedolah. The men feared with a great fear. They were terrified. And then Jonah tells them how they can avoid drowning by throwing him into the water, and then the water would calm. And they didn't want to do that, but finally they realized that's what they had to do. So after trying to row away, so look at verse 14. This is so unexpected. It says, then they cried out to Yahweh, and they said, we pray, O Yahweh, please don't let us perish for this man's life, and do not charge us with innocent blood, for you, Yahweh, have done as it pleases you. There's not one Yahweh in chapter 3 with reference to the Assyrians, but in one verse, chapter 1, verse 14, the word Yahweh is used 3 times. These men have come to faith. And how did it happen? Well, look back in chapter 1, verse 10. There must have been a lull in the storm, because Jonah says much more than the record indicates. As we read the words, they knew that he'd fled from the presence of Yahweh because he had told them. So he told them a lot. And it was enough that the Spirit of God worked through his words in their lives. And at the thought of their imminent deaths, they came to faith in God. And the word Yahweh is used 3 times. Now look at verse 16. When they got to dry land, the men feared Yahweh exceedingly. Now the fear is not fright or terror, but now it's adoration and reverence and awe and saving faith. And we know that they offered a sacrifice to Yahweh. Do you see that? And they took vows. And what are the vows they would take? We've been in the Psalms of Lament. We know what the vow is. It's a vow of praise. They're going to go all the way to Jerusalem. They're going to go to the temple of Yahweh, and they, as foreign nationals, are going to stand in the courts of the temple, and they're going to tell those who will listen to them, we were drowning, and a Hebrew prophet, a man of Yahweh, told us about God, and we threw him into the sea, and we presume he drowned. But our lives were saved, and we've come here to give praise to Yahweh for saving us from drowning, and now for making us his people. That is the great miracle of salvation in the book of Jonah. And I don't bet, but I'm imagining that you've never heard that part of the story before, have you? You've thought the Assyrians came to faith en masse. They didn't, but the Phoenicians on the ship did. The language of the chapter contrasts with that of 3. The sailors move from fear of the water to fear of Jonah, to fear in the sense of saving faith in the person of Yahweh. And that is overwhelming. So that is the great story. Now, the key is the use of the name Yahweh. When we read of the response of the Assyrians, God is used. They did respond in fear of judgment, but the responses of the Phoenicians, the name Yahweh is used over and over and over. Now it's fear, but it's not fright. It's awe and wonder and worship and true faith. So I believe that the Phoenician sailors are in heaven today. We'd love to know that some Assyrians came to faith as well, but the Bible emphasizes the Phoenician sailors as the ones who came to faith.